Good afternoon and welcome to the session SE8520, Private Cloud, Virtualization, Security, and Compliance, Meeting PCI Standards. Hi, I'm Alvin Sequeira, VP for Security Network Solutions at VMware. And with me is a very distinguished panel out here. We've done this a year ago. Let me go ahead and introduce the analyst, the vendor, and Christoph.
There is no category.
So, Neil, if you could introduce yourself, and then we go.
Sure. My name is Neil McDonald. I'm a Vice President and Gartner Fellow. I've been looking at the intersection of virtualization and security and compliance and extending that into cloud computing for about 4 years now. I follow this topic very closely, present on it at the Gartner conferences, and I've been with Gartner now 15 years.
And I'm Brett Hartman. I'm the CTO for RSA and an EMC fellow. Hope you're a Cisco fellow.
I'm not a fellow.
Oh, man. I'm responsible for, defining the overall technology strategy for RSA, and I work with the other CTOs across EMC in terms of how security fits into the bigger strategy, and work a lot with strategic partners like VMware.
I do the same thing, but I'm not a fellow. So my name is, that came out wrong.
This is kind of
I'm a fellow.
We're going downhill already.
Yes, so my name is Christoph, and I'm actually a vendor also. I work for Cisco, and I do very similar activities, but I'm also tasked with cloud and virtualization security strategy for our security technology business unit.
Thanks. So point of note before we get started, I'd love to make this an interactive session. So if you do have questions, if you could come up and stand, and we'll intersperse the questions through the conversation out here. With that, let me get started. Neil, Brett, and Chris, we were here a year ago. From your perspective, I'd love to have you share your thoughts with the group here of what's changed, what are the important trends that you've seen as you've talked to your customer base, your partners, etc., in terms of cloud, virtualization, compliance, security, the works. Neil, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start with virtualization and security. I've got some good news, and that is I've seen an overall increase in the maturity of customers deploying virtualization and engaging early on with the security group, which didn't used to be the case. Originally, when I started this research back in 2006, 2007, security was typically not involved. Now I see security being involved, and the topic is switching away from how do I deploy virtualization securely, which is important, but we seem to have that foundational element in place, and now we're switching the conversation to how can I virtualize security controls, how can I perhaps do things differently or do things better in a virtualized data center. I think that gets pretty exciting. Instead of being a doom and gloom conversation, it's a conversation about potential and things could be better. What's interesting with cloud is it's almost going through the same type of evolution and maturity. Right now, there's a whole bunch of concern. It's the number one cited concern in Gartner surveys is security and privacy as an inhibitor to the adoption of cloud computing. And I think when you peel back the onion and you dig into that, there's some truth in what the concerns are. And I also think there's some hype. And the biggest amount of hype I see is that people are afraid of losing control. It's someone else's data center, someone else's machine, therefore I can't trust it. And when I talk to these clients, my point is, like it or not, we're losing control anyways. When you look at the consumerization, the use of consumer devices by our employees, when you look at supporting a mobile workforce from anywhere, anytime access, from home machines, when you look at the move to collaborate and externalize our processes and install things like SharePoint and open up to outside partners, all of these are pieces of evidence that say we don't own and control all the pieces of our IT infrastructure anymore. Virtualization extends that. Cloud computing, to me, is just a logical extension of where we're going.
Thanks, Neil. Brett, you've spent a lot of time with customers.
Yeah, so I think we've made some pretty reasonable progress over the last year. So about a year ago, we were to the point you're just making around this requirement with respect to visibility, control, and compliance in the cloud. But it was a lot of messaging, a lot of just awareness, a lot of anxiety, right to the point. Earlier this year, back at the RSA conference, we did what I thought was a pretty cool demonstration of what we could do. We did it in partnership with Intel and VMware and showed that we could actually define a chain of trust from the bare metal hardware using Intel Trusted Execution technology, tying that into the virtual infrastructure, into vCenter, tying that into things like data loss prevention, and then tying that up into, in fact, one of the topics of today, PCI compliance in terms of starting to develop all the connections from the bottom to the top of the stack, and then providing a dashboard report that auditors can understand. So we did that back in the RSA conference. What was that, February? So that was a kind of a thought leadership exercise and got a lot of interest there. And now for this conference at VMworld, we've announced that's now an official RSA solution around this notion of security and compliance in the cloud. So what we've been busy working on with both at RSA and with Intel and VMware, really turning that from kind of vision to something that can be deployed. And we're working with a number of service providers there. And that continues. So now we have another demonstration, this time that's POC still, which pulls in geolocation. And I'll save for that for later. But the notion of geolocation and how that ties into compliance is a pretty cool topic, too. So, I mean, we're getting there bit by bit. But I feel like we're making some progress. And we now have some technology that's available for service providers and tenants to actually use and deploy.
Very much so. Chris?
Your turn. Don't be too negative.
No, not at all. So I think we've got lots of great technology. I think, however, the biggest problems that we still haven't dealt with very well over the last year are really organizational, operational, and cultural. I mean, we tend to use the singular noun of the cloud and kind of lumping all deployment and delivery models into a single noun, which makes it very confusing when we talk about what we actually mean when we're talking about moving workloads, data, information, and where those threats and concerns really are. So without 47 slides of cloud definitions, I think the thing we have done a poor job on is separating out and not conflating security with compliance, which is why I find the title of this talk interesting, because most people say security is the barrier to entry to cloud. I maintain that if you want to pick on public cloud like Amazon, I maintain that you could take pretty much any application you have today, whether you rewrite it or package an existing one and deploy it as securely or even potentially more securely in an Amazon environment than you can in your enterprise. The problem isn't technology. The problem is if you have an auditor that comes along after the fact and is charged with assessing your ability to be compliant given the types of information and content that app traffics in, that's the real stumbling block for me, is not the security, not technology, not even the elements that have changed with risk management. It's this horrible four-letter word, compliance. And we continue to struggle with it. And I think the thing that was interesting this morning on listening to another talk was kind of Davi Ottner gave a great kind of painted this picture of kind of analogy of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance when he was talking about the technical versus the romantic approach to kind of how you deal with, for example, tuning a motorcycle and your approach to riding one. And he alluded using that same analogy to cloud. And what was very interesting was on the one side, he was talking about how we have all these great capabilities that are very similar to what we do today, and you have a new delivery model. On the other side, he kind of, at the end, really kind of annoyed me with a couple of statements that were basically like, he said, people always ask him the question, when are auditors going to catch up to cloud? And he said, well, that's the wrong question. The question should be, when is cloud going to catch up to auditors? And I was like, wow, how's that for arrogance? I just thought that was a very interesting way of suggesting that compliance and audit can exist in a bubble, and that despite the fact that everything else can change, including the technology, compliance and audit doesn't have to. They're so pure and so holy and the concepts are so applicable to everything that, from a PI's perspective, there's no need for us to change. And so, for me, that cultural and organizational operational gap about how we're measured is really the thing that just sucks away my life when it comes to talking about being able to promote cloud as a fantastic platform. It sucks. So that hasn't changed at all.
What is this, like kill all the auditors or something? We gotta
I love auditors. No, it's not that.
So that brings up another interesting question. As we move from enterprise architectures to the cloud to virtualization, Who do you think owns issues like compliance? Is it the enterprise? Is it the cloud provider? What's the separation of roles between the risk officers, the compliance officers, security? Any perspectives and thoughts there? Brett, you want to?
I think that's really the heart of the challenge and the point that Chris is making about why compliance is particularly tough in this environment is because of that loss of control and the fact that now instead of all those resources being under the physical and logical control within an organization, a single data center, you're now relying on somebody else, this service provider, to do a bunch of the work for you and protect it. And so even if it's super secure and they have all the right technology in place, how do you know? I mean, they're all going to say, of course, trust me, I'm doing the right thing. They're going to sign the SLAs, all that stuff. But how do you know? And that's a challenge because you're now splitting that responsibility up.
But that was the point I was making earlier, right? That we can't have to control it. We
That's
won't
right.
have control. So
That's right.
the question is, what substitutes for control? What gives us that confidence that the provider has indeed done the things they say they do? And that's where there aren't. I haven't seen a good industry standard for cloud compliance.
Yeah,
There's effort.
SAS 70
SAS 70 is not sufficient, and you know it. You're just saying that as a joke, right? But
No, and I think it's really...
You're talking to a guy with Hobbit shoes on, dude. It's, not really...
SAS 70's not worth the paper that it's not written on. That's how I feel about SAS 70.
And I think it's pretty early for those standards, but we are beginning to see some ways, some tools. I mean, the ones I mentioned that we're working on and others to be able to pull this evidence up to demonstrate it to others.
But
others do use tools like that today, like Archer and other products like that. And they do need to be standardized, to your point, right, to work across multiple cloud providers.
So I thought what you all did was really interesting, but what I was hoping for was more people signing up and saying, yes, this is great, so we'll have a standard for exchanging this audit and config information across, not just an EMC thing, but across the industry.
I think the challenge there, at least the way we see it, is we talk to service providers. They really like this idea of having some kind of tool to differentiate, to compete in the market for one service provider to show they have a better, more secure or more compliant approach than another service provider. So the service providers are still, since it's so early, they're battling for their own territory, so they're not ready to admit that they want to play nicely with each other.
What's your thought on this, Chris?
Well, I'm selfishly motivated by the fact that I agree with the need for a standard. However, I don't want to define the actual compliance or redefine the actual compliance framework. So a bunch of us got together and we formed a group called Cloud Audit. And Cloud Audit is actually a really interesting approach to standardizing the way in which you organize information that all providers can use to allow then tools and customers in a more regimented and standardized way to gain access to assertion data relative to compliance. So you have a bunch of namespaces that map to using the Cloud Security Alliance's controls matrix, and those namespaces, that's a fancy word for directories, essentially exist using web-based protocols at these cloud providers, and most of the larger ones on the planet are starting to participate in terms of their involvement of giving feedback, and even some of them are looking at prototyping it. But then being able to use a standard way, strangely enough, of just organizing materials that talk about going to the same place with every provider to extract that information using whatever tools you want, it is such an amazingly stupid idea that I thought we ought to do it, since everyone talks about being compliant. We're measured on the same thing, so I figured, well, why don't we define a common way of getting to it? So I think that's one element from a kind of supply-driven demand approach where cloud providers start implementing it that lets them, first of all, automate the collection and presentation of that material in a time that is more than measured in eons, right? So today, every 6 months would be considered an aggressive audit schedule. For me, given the flexibility and agility of cloud, compliance needs to be, whether you hate real-time monitoring as a moniker or not, it needs to be as near-term as you need it to be, given the changes of operations that are no longer in your control. So I think a lot of this comes to standards, but standard ways of interacting with data that we all know we have to answer anyway.
The trouble with standards, as we've heard, is a lot of standards crop up and pop up every day. One of the more successful frameworks for compliance has been PCI because it had teeth. it was driven with very specific prescriptive definitional objects, and it's been implemented by the industry. Do you believe we need something like a PCI body for the cloud world where there's some teeth, where there are penalties assessed? Do you believe we need to go there, or let innovation and entrepreneurship take its course?
Well, I decided actually to answer that question in advance, so I ran out of paper.
1 second.
Brace yourself, everybody.
So, Neil, in your honor, what I did was I drafted a magic quadrant of things to discuss that are more fun to argue about. So I put Gartner down here, and PCI is up and to the right. So I figured, as it relates to the popularity and relevance of existing standards for measurement, do we need a PCI for the cloud? No, I don't think we need a separate one. I think we have 15 standards that we can measure things on. And in fact, Cloud Audit, as I described, actually aligns to the control matrix, which is PCI, NIST 853, ISO 27002, HIPAA, and is extensible, right? To Davi's point, which I think he was really trying to make this morning, you don't need a whole bunch of new stuff to be measured. You just need an effective way of measuring it.
Yeah, the answer to a lack of a standard is not to create another standard.
All right,
We got
up more. Then.
No, but seriously, what we need is PCI DSS to clarify very specifically what it means interpretation for virtualized environments, which is coming, and for cloud environments, right? And that's what needs to happen. The standards need to evolve.
Let me take a question from the audience. Go ahead. If you could be.
Besides Chris taking his shirt off, right? That's,
Yeah, that's an interesting.
But it's just like, is there a standard way to do a background check on that babysitter, right? You'd like to, the more guidelines are around to check on that babysitter, the easier job you have, the more likely it is you'll have some confidence, as opposed to like calling all the references and all that stuff. If there's an easier way to do it, right? So that's what we're talking about, standards to help, make it easier to compare.
That would then come back to some sort of liability on their part if they didn't conform to the standard.
Right.
True.
And really, it's a contract liability.
Well, and that's
Yeah.
True.
The change of responsibility and liability, from my point of view, is that none of the vendors are willing to take that on from an operational perspective because it's too large a risk to business, and that seems to be sort of the...
why do we have the expectation that they would? What is different about cloud than any other outsourced contract that all of a sudden, right? So I put on my other devil's advocate hat, and I think that's a very interesting point where people are throwing up their arms, regardless of cloud computing as the platform or delivery mechanism. If they outsource something with an SI last year or 2 years ago, and they tried to put indemnity clauses and things like that, right? There's that activity which just because you go to Amazon or any other cloud provider, there's a weird expectation now where somehow we jump some great chasm where a cloud provider that provides computing capabilities is somehow going to absolve me of accountability versus responsibility. And it's a weird, I don't know how that came to be. I don't understand.
I think it's just every time you just hope that'll be the case.
Yes.
But I don't think there's any indication that will be the case. Which then argues that they better provide some good evidence back and some be transparent, right? So that you can, because if you're going to take the risk, you better know what they're doing.
well, I agree with Chris's point. If you look at the business process outsourcing in HR, I think the latest Gartner data is 70% outsource some element of HR. It's either benefits or payroll. And arguably, those are very, very critical. And yet, we've dealt with these issues before, so they're not new. So Chris's question is, so why are people creating this wall of adoption? And my take on it is, I think there is some inherent reaction from our internal organizations of people looking at the cloud as a potential threat for the future of infrastructure, future of applications. And so some of this is, hold on, security and privacy as a roadblock for adoption. And to me, it's a very fuzzy word. What exactly is the security concern? We don't have 100% security in our own infrastructure today. So throwing out a word like security and trying to hold an arbitrary level of compliance, to me, it just makes no sense.
Yeah, if I could, I sort of agree with that. I think, if you got to separate the issues. Compliance is sort of a statement of current alignment to some set of measurements, right? But there's still the issue of what am I measuring and how am I measuring it? And to your point, Brett, how am I proving on a continuous basis that I am measuring
Right.
what I say I'm measuring, right? So I think, Chris, if there's sort of a disconnect, which I agree that somehow it should be better or worse, or the responsibility shifts in the cloud, it's because it's even more amorphous. But it's really the same physical issue.
So let's let's take that topic between the vendors, the providers, or the ecosystem, or the integrators. Where do you see the responsibility for building in some of these compliance primitives, automation scripts, etc.? How do you see it playing itself out over the next year? Because if there's anything that we have learned over the last couple of years, there's a lot of inertia out there. Someone has to take the lead and start with building in automated scripts for what is seemingly a very, very important fundamental.
I think marketing is taking that lead currently.
Really good marketing.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that you can't answer that singularly. You have to either talk about the delivery model, right? So in software as a service, the provider owns the stack. If you look at the terms of service, for example, of Salesforce.com, they have a great clause that talks about what they do and don't do in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability. If you go down the stack and look at infrastructure as a service, right, and where the line is drawn, while the infrastructure is managed and maintained to maximize availability, you still have to do everything else you would otherwise do to a system that runs on a physical box or even one virtualized in your own data center. Right. And so we have compartmentalized compliance. So what's interesting today is, like, I keep seeing announcements of service providers, and I keep writing a blog saying, can you tell me what's in scope when you say you're PCI compliant? So, for example, Mosso tried it 2 years ago. They said, hey, we help this customer become PCI compliant, right? We are PCI compliant. And I said, really? And so we dug deeper, and what we found out was all PCI in-scope data was offloaded to another network and never touched theirs. So yes, you're compliant by obscurity. That's awesome. And then, like I just saw another announcement by Verizon that says we're PCI compliant, right? Our cloud. Okay, what happens when a customer shoves an app on top of it? How do you deal with the scoping issues? Now I have to deal with two sets, and how do I merge the two things of what transits, what is it? So, what's very interesting is when we talk about it, the delivery model is so very important about how we describe any compliance, not just PCI, but and that's why conflating the stuff of we're moving to cloud, like public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud. What kind of cloud are you talking about, right? SPI, which one?
Right. So that's a good point. Cloud is not one thing, so cloud security can't be one thing. It's a great point. But back to this gentleman's observation, I'm more on the consumer side, right? I'm a consumer of this cloud resource. I'm going to demand compliance and evidence of compliance through the RFI and RFP process, typically for higher levels of cloud-based services. And I don't know the providers would do it unless we, collectively in the audience, we're out there saying security and privacy are our number one issue. Survey after survey after survey. They're asking for evidence of compliance, evidence of security, evidence of patch management, vulnerability management, background checks. That's what you're asking for. And what we were talking about earlier was, can we at least standardize how we could ask for that type of compliance information so we could look across providers and make reasonable decisions?
That stuff is expensive. The problem is for a provider to offer, right? So in many cases, you get the difference between good enough and or particular verticals, markets, or customers that transit more, information. They're going to charge you more. And that's why we see the offshoot of, we have mass market cloud providers like Amazon who deliver awesome service for for data that isn't highly regulated or otherwise classified, right? And then you have folks like a Terramark or a Savvis who come from the enterprise background, co-location, hosting, and that sort of outsourcing market that are building in, you want a Gigamon tap so that you can look at and run an IDS sensor on the network physically as it transits? Sure. Cost you a little bit more. You want to be able to do IPS and virtual firewalling? Sure. Cost you a little bit more. But those networks, services, the platforms, all of those things matter, right? So it starts when we start talking about comparative ways of asking three cloud providers, like, do you have firewall service? At some point, right, a non-stateful inbound ACL which is marketed as a firewall service, they could answer yes across three different platform providers. And so now we're going to get the mechanisms by which we actually describe what a firewall means It's like we're back to the 80s again. So this is a challenge that we have to, this terminology and the metrics and management for how we actually describe what things a cloud provider actually delivers to us, really seems simple, but it's going to be a pain in the butt.
And I think that if I can, back to your question around, who's responsible, is it around compliance? I think so, and all security vendors say, yes, we do compliance, right? And all service providers, because everybody does 5% of compliance, right? That's part of the problem. Right, And so what that means is so great for their part of this pie, they do a great job, but it's still going to be up to the end consumer, who's probably going to be the enterprise, to assemble all those pieces together to demonstrate for their auditors if they're compliant for their requirements. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
And one of the things that we have noticed is this is not only expensive, it is incredibly complex. When you mash up storage, compute, networking kind of services together in order to even realize the infrastructure of service, it is in fact a fairly complex undertaking. There are lots of knobs all over the stack. At the end of the day, what you're trying to deliver is secure multi-tenant partitions that are isolated temporally and spatially, meaning as you give resources, whether it's storage resources or compute resources to your consumer, who's either an application or an actual end user, you got to make sure that you give them something that's clean. If it was used by some other tenant before, it's got to be cleaned up and given to the next tenant. Likewise, there's got to be no crosstalk with tenants next door. Likewise, folks are very concerned about separation of duties, separating out the cloud provider, the tenant, and the tenant next to you, etc. To put all these together in a multi-vendor fashion is very hard, which is why I believe programs like the V-blocks or standing up multi-stacked, multi-vendor stacks that come pre-prepared have to address some of the audit concerns in it might make sense.
I think the other point, too, is that the more that you have verticalized service providers, maybe, for example, focus on healthcare or focus on the federal government or focused on retail, it's more likely that they can do more of the compliance, right, because they're targeted to a particular set of regulatory requirements, and then there's less of a burden on that end customer, hopefully. So, to me, that's a good reason to have more verticalized offerings like that, right, because then they can have more expertise.
Question from you?
I just wanted to make a quick point. The ownership of compliance rests with the owner of the data, who owns the IT asset.
It's true.
And the guiding principle would be to add the cost of compliance and security to your total cost of ownership of putting this stuff on the cloud. And that's the piece which I think enterprise needs to do when we stack up all the costs. Like you said, security may be available at varying levels at additional cost. So we need to put a complete dollar figure and then see what's the total cost of ownership.
That risk management threat modeling piece is interesting because if you ask a business owner, like, are you the owner of the data? A lot of times they don't want to take ownership of anything. Oh, that's IT's problem. No, I'm the custodian. Like, I make stuff happen. No, you're the owner of it. Okay, until they need something, in which case they put their foot down. I'm the owner of the data, and I need, right? So the interesting thing is, when IT is no longer involved, let's say in this public cloud utility where a guy can take out his Amex card and spin up a service, right? This mythical thing that happens every day. What's interesting there is so at the end of the day, if you are breached or you have an issue with data spillage or leakage, is the business owner that wasn't taking ownership for his data actually going to absorb liability associated with the fact that he didn't read the end user license agreement, checked the box, and spun up an AMI? So that I think is goes back to that cultural operational management thing, right? About how that's why most of my customers, especially those that are heavily regulated in lots of different industries, are really investing in private cloud, not because they don't necessarily have a distrust of the cloud providers, but they need to basically round off the sharp edges on operationally what it means to prepare audit, both operational risk folks, the business unit, their own teams, the security guys, and get them up to speed on what cloud in any fashion looks like and what automation does to their practices, so that when it's time to move more stuff to a public-based cloud or even a hybrid or whatever you want to call it environment, they understand the mechanical changes, right? So it's not public versus private cloud computing, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it shouldn't matter. and it goes to the point that was made earlier, that the challenge is going to be how we think about how we actually experience that compute and how we manage risk. But that dollar amount, then, the soft cost, it becomes a squeezing the balloon problem. Right? I may save money on CapEx, but the soft cost of actually then having to instantiate new practices, new policies, new technology, new people, new audit processes is it comes from somewhere. And I think that goes back to the first statement I made. That's the huge problem. Not the technology side. We got lots of widgets. It's there's no patch for stupid, so we got people we have to deal with, right? And that's the problem.
Neil, you have a perspective?
Well, what I was going to add was there's a positive side to this, and that is this whole shift to private and public cloud computing is forcing information security professionals to move up the stack, looking away from protecting individual devices and servers and locking things down to looking at protecting information, which was our charter from the very beginning, from day one. And somewhere along the way, we kind of lost sight of that. But now we're getting back to who owns the information, who's accountable, who's responsible, what information what business process does it support, what's the sensitivity of that information, where is it born, where does it flow throughout my systems, where is it retired. That's the conversation we should have been having for the past 15 years. The nice thing is cloud and the move to private or public is forcing that conversation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Neil. One of the conversations we've begun to have with the security professionals, the compliance professionals within an organization is they, for the most part, sat on the sidelines during the first wave of virtualization, which is equivalent to a lot of the cloud principles. We strongly exhort security, compliance, audit professionals to be a large part of the best practices as you stand up private clouds. Because like Chris was saying, it's more important, the issue is not public cloud versus private cloud. The issue is, have you got your people processes right? And you can get that right as you stand up a private cloud. But we have to get in and weave ourselves into the fabric as folks stand up clouds versus playing the part of saying, no, that didn't meet the need, nope, that didn't meet the need. Instead, we have to proactively be part of it that says this is what will help stand up a compliant, auditable stack.
There's some more questions.
Chris, question from there?
So I agree with Chris that security and compliance are very different topics, and you can be more secure essentially in the cloud than you are on premise. But the only question that really matters is, what does the PCI Council stand on cloud security? And if they don't have guidance for when is it coming, and are the QSAs actually ready to audit cloud environments? I think beyond that, nothing else really matters. Not even the ability to assert compliance. There's nobody to audit.
So that's an interesting question. Love to hear the panel's thought. Are the QSAs and all the self-appointed auditors for the cloud?
There's a very complex formula. It is the ability to pass an audit is directly proportional to the intelligence of your QSA multiplied by the cost you paid for him to do a terrible job. So as that asymptotically approaches zero, I think we'll get. Oh wait. Your point is valid, right? And I think, sitting on the PCI DSS virtualization SIG, there's tons of great guidance coming from lots of people who get it, but that's just guidance that goes back to the council that ultimately has to go through an entire process to actually get reflected into the next rev of DSS. Yeah, what is the timeline? So the reality is that we've seen the timeline shift in terms of that phase to like 3 years now, I think, right, in terms of guidance revision. And I kind of understand both sides. Anytime you make a change to guidance that is that big and that impactful from an economic perspective, like we just say, well, you should just change your guidance and tell us what to do and be prescriptive. Well, the problem is that flows downhill to everyone, to like a mom and pop point of sale operator, right? So that guidance is much broader than just IT. So I kind of understand why they want to be very cautious, but it shouldn't take, for example, not to pick on PCI, but why not? When we saw the biggest breaches happen, and they 9 out of 10 were because of crappy wireless, and it took monstrous breaches and huge monetary fines, ultimately over and over again before they changed it. We shouldn't be reactive that way. If we know what's coming, the frustration, I think, is from those of us that are practitioners or even vendors that could help make a difference, is that it takes too long to actually affect those changes. And that goes to my point when I was talking about before, where you're telling me audit and compliance can function in a vacuum outside of disruptive innovation that wholesalely changes the environment in which you're being asked to operate, and they just don't move fast enough. And so we could sit here and come up with the perfect set of solutions, but that's the problem that you illustrate. That's just not solvable by anybody in this room. It's, it just seems to be very, very disconnected process-wise.
Brett, do you have a perspective on this?
So I'm not, not being an auditor, I'm sorry, I can't answer the question specifically, but it does seem like, the way I understand the audit process works, it's based on precedent, and there's always a few companies that are willing to take that risk to establish the precedents for any new technology. I'm not sure this is any different than all the pick everyone, client server and all kinds of distributed systems that have happened before. Those had new risks as they were rolled out as well. And it seems like the way the auditing community works is they set these, they say, okay, we have, back to your original point about, our auditor's king. Maybe they are right in terms of there's a set of requirements that are true regardless of technology. Yeah. And they say, show me that you have the right IT controls in place to be able to, address these requirements, and that becomes it's very subjective, right? And that's the problem.
Ultimately, it is
right?
subjective.
So why is this any different? So I'm sorry I can't speak to when, but it seems like this process in terms of virtualization in the cloud and whether we have the right controls in place to pass a PCI audit are no different than what we've seen for other technologies.
With virtualization, it's taken too long, right? We shouldn't be sitting here in the fall of 2010 when virtualization, VMware's been around a decade, right? So that I agree with. What I've seen from customers is it comes down to the auditor. So even as specific as PCI DSS
who's going to make the call? Yeah.
Right? They'll have one QSA that will accept a PCI-related workload and a non-PCI-related workload if there's no communication between them and there's a stateful firewall on the same physical host. I've seen them accept that, and I've seen other cases where the auditor said, no, you can't do that.
And they're talking about, for example, VLANs being acceptable, right, to maintain control in terms of what's in and out of scope, for example.
Or not.
Right, that's been debated. In fact, last year there was a panel, there were several QSAs, and several said at that point last year they were comfortable last year in terms of what was in place. So it's clear there's clearly no consensus for auditors yet. I don't know.
Well,
I don't know if there are any auditors in the audience.
There are lots of auditors in the audience. You can see them. You can see them rocking back and forth like this, just like
they're ready to yell at us.
No, yes, absolutely. Controlled objectives that's associated with high-level requirements for audit, absolutely sound. Doesn't really matter about the technology application. However, my point is just the compressed time frame. It's not like this thing just snuck up on us. It's not like, virtualization, look at that. And the point is, when you don't have an effective way of given this compressed time frame and given how disruptive this stuff is, to even let us know what we're going to be held accountable for so we can make good decisions, let alone what the QSA is going to decide, that's problematic. And these folks just want to know what they can do to leverage technology to make their bosses happy. And you know what? Being compliant is good, but it's the floor, not the ceiling, right? And unfortunately, what we're incentivized to do is answer the checklists and not actually do the right thing. Yeah. Do the checklist thing.
Are there any auditors out there that have opinions?
It'd be good. Any auditors in the room here?
Any QSAs?
Yeah, QSAs. Uh-oh.
Yeah, I wouldn't either.
Yeah, don't admit it.
We'll probably see them here in 2014.
Yeah, I have a question for you guys.
Good.
So I didn't hear a clear answer to, is it the supplier responsible for delivering the trust and safety of the cloud, or is it the user responsible for making sure the cloud provider does it?
Yes. Depends on the delivery model. Yes.
Part of the question, isn't it going to be a competitive issue for the cloud providers to demonstrate who has the most trusted and demonstrable platform?
Yeah, well, as Chris was saying, it also depends on what the provider is providing, right? Is it infrastructure, platform, or software as a service? Because depending on what that service provider...
First two at least, right?
Yeah, right. Then it's going to be, providing more of that stack. But then at the end of the day, it's still, the evidence has got to come back to that enterprise.
Yeah.
But the proof part, I think, has to be provided by the provider, by the vendor of the outsourced service.
Yeah, but the consumer has to ask for the proof. That's why Chris is saying it's both.
Yeah. I actually totally agree with that.
Right. But don't you think they are? Don't you think the consumers
I think we're getting better at the RFIR.
I think No, I think that, and at least CISOs I talk to, they say they're just not going to make a move unless they have something.
The auditor is auditing the customer, not the provider. It flows through, but at the end of the day, the customer is responsible.
That's right.
But
or at least accountable.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
The way I look at it is, regardless of whether you get a compliance check mark from the provider or not, ultimately when you own your assets, you move your assets up to the cloud, regardless of what they tell you they're provided, you have to have defense in depth. You have to also have your additional controls in place to assure yourself that if there's something gone wrong out there, that you still have some controls in place, that you encrypt your data, that you have need-to-know access, you federate back to your Active Directory back at home, etc. I think till you come to a world where that's all automated and well built in, I don't think we are at the mode quite yet where we could trust someone's compliance check mark, right? Or auditable check mark.
It wasn't the question at all.
Yeah.
Who's responsible for delivering trusted safety? Because
Yeah.
I flew down here, I flew down on an airline, and I didn't stand in one line for a safe ticket and another line for an unsafe ticket, right?
Oh, you flew United.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I'm saying that market forces will drive
Yes.
that, I think, ultimately.
Well, the other thing in addition that service providers are considering are compliance services themselves. So SaaS-based compliance services to make it easier for those tenants to demonstrate the case. So in addition to providing the evidence, they can, there's ways to do it. I mean, that's some of the stuff we're working on, right? So that's yet another thing that they can provide is to help assemble that for that tenant. That's useful.
I think your statement of truth is really the notion, and then it comes a definition of what does that mean?
Right.
Yeah.
What is proof, right? The security controls are in place, that's proof.
So let me switch gears a little bit, Neil, starting with you here. You'll have had a lot of experience working with your customers and with other partners in the industry. What best practices would you recommend to folks in the room here today as they embark on cloud and virtualization from a compliance perspective? What best practices, prescriptive practices would you recommend? What steps do they take today?
There was an excellent session earlier in the week on virtualization and PCI. I think it was by a third-party auditing firm. I forget the name. But if you can pull the material, it was an excellent set of checklists. But if you go through, because this gentleman went through all the sections of PCI DSS, number one on every single one of them was documentation. Show me the controls. Show me the controls you put in place, the monitoring, the logging, the eventing, the alerting. Show me the documentation of the logical process flow of the credit card information. It all came down to the number one piece of advice was documentation. I agree with what the gentleman was presenting in that session.
That's a good one to point to.
So yeah, maybe building on Neil's point. I mean, so then it's how can you provide that documentation? There are tools. We and other vendors provide such tools to make it easier to construct that documentation. So that's useful. I think the other thing too is focusing on this notion of the chain of trust, right? To be able to understand the different enforcement mechanisms up and down the stack that are relevant to the compliance requirements. It's never going to be one single part of the stack provided by any single piece of technology. So how to connect those things together, I think, is really important, and that's something that service providers are working really hard on. So that helps as well.
So I'll bubble it up another level. How many of you have heard of the Cloud Security Alliance? How many of you have read the guidance?
Yeah.
All right, so I think this is a useful thing for those of you who haven't.
Good.
So what the CSA, what we did was we built a set of guidance focused on 12 areas of concern, everywhere from forensics. So you've got architecture, governing the cloud, operating the cloud. Right, and what it does is a reasonably good job of explaining the differences between cloud computing and the similarities between what you do today in cloud computing. And then we have a series of research areas, for example, top 10 threats, the cloud controls matrix that I talk about that basically has a bunch of control objectives that let you evaluate and understand how a cloud provider, whether it's an external public cloud provider or even an internal operation, maps to various compliance frameworks like PCI, NIST, HIPAA, etc. So if you're wondering what's different and what's the same about cloud and how you should approach those things and what language you should use, since we standardize on stuff like NIST in the guidance, and you haven't read it, get that, because it's a really good way of being able to drop that little skinny document package off on your auditor's desk so that you guys will be speaking the same language in many cases, your internal audit. And if your external auditor or QSA has never heard of the Cloud Security Alliance and they show up to do your cloud audit, and it's probably a bad sign. So, for me, then you can kind of use that at the top level and bubble your way down. Because I think in many cases, I didn't mean to disagree or suggest that, audit is a bad thing. I'm a CISA. I've been on that side of the fence many a time. And been on the other side of the fence many a time too, being audited. And so the reality is I just think that a lot of this comes down to every time we have one of these disruptive innovations, whether it's technology or whatever, we have this calibration time, to your point. But the interesting thing is, and I totally agree with Neil, in the rapid time frame of the last 5 years with virtualization and cloud, it's really forcing our profession as a forcing function to go focus on those things that matter most. So if you've ever seen my presentation, I have this hamster security sine wave of pain that indicates kind of how we invest over time and why we do what we do in terms of we swing from the network to the host, to the network to the host, and bounce back and forth and never focus on the information. This is one thing that if you're gracefully giving up control with cloud, you don't have a choice but to focus on it. So, all that stuff is goodness. The technology will catch up. Some of it's already here. Work on speaking a common language with your auditors, with your execs, and set expectations right with your security team so that they don't try to fight this thing because it's a losing proposition.
And you've recently announced the cloud audit document and guidelines. Is that now part of the cloud?
So both Cloud Security Alliance is a group that any of you can join, and I run another project called Cloud Audit, which is open to the world, contributed to by most of the large cloud providers, auditors, consumers, and that's an open project where you can go and download. That's cloudaudit.org. Cloudsecurityalliance.org is the other URL. If you go to cloudaudit.org, you can download the map namespaces, the cloud control matrix stuff, and kind of get a feel for how you're ultimately going to be interacted with by your auditors, because they're starting to download this stuff. ISACA and those groups are looking at how they use ANISA's risk assessment documents, as well as the Cloud Security Alliance controls matrix to evaluate you. Outside of whatever the compliance spec says, they're looking at this because this is the only reasonable way that they have of being able to themselves understand the difference. So
it's one of the few resources they can go to.
That's right. There are so few ways of bridging that gap.
It helps them.
Get that stuff, and you can participate in both of those groups, and you'll be miles ahead.
We'll take one final question. Or actually, we have a couple of questions. Go ahead. From the back of the room, way back.
My question is about system management. Almost always use it. It's kind of broken when you go to the cloud because of the loss of
PKI.
the problem of key management outside of the control. How do you go about
Brett, you want to take it? So.
Why are you picking on me?
Or you're a fellow.
Yeah, really. That's right. Yeah. Oh, Lord, PKI. No indication. Certainly not any easier, right? To the point. I don't so far see any good indications of that any cloud providers are making much progress in terms of PKI-based solutions. There's work. I mean, some of the work that VMware is doing. We've been doing work with VMware as well in terms of building authentication brokers and things that map authentication credentials across multiple providers. I'm not sure if PKI is even the right answer, frankly, as far as that goes. That's going to be the underlying basis of authentication in the cloud anyway. Maybe that's probably the better place to start.
But the interesting point is, like, for example, there's a bunch of key technology overlays like VPNs, right? Yeah. So VPNs, multi-point VPNs within even private hosts, right, all depend in many cases either upon pre-shared secrets or
a lot of key management.
Keys. Yeah. So cloud is the revenge of PKI. It's one of my slides. There's a whole bunch of them that come back to life, right? Identity access management, brokered, federated identity. It's like bell bottoms. Every 15 years, they unfortunately come back into style. So you're absolutely right, but you're not going to get an answer out of the panel on what do I do about PKI in 34 seconds. So it's a problem.
Yeah.
Go ahead. There's a question there.
Yeah,
go ahead.
acquisition?
What do you think?
Can't you put up that Fair Harbor thing that just basically says forward-looking statements and yada yada?
I think it's cool. I
my job.
think it's Tri-Cypress. I've talked to them a bunch. I think it's great technology. I mean, we've been talking to them a bunch in terms of, for example, how RSA authentication mechanisms plug in. So I think it made huge sense for VMware. We talked a lot to VMware about it. It's a good, really, approach to solve very specific requirements in terms of authenticating, especially to SaaS providers to solve a very specific problem. And it'll keep expanding. I mean, it's not the end of the story by any means in terms of authentication to the cloud, and we'll keep working.
Yeah, it's part of our strategy to build in basic security controls into the stack itself, and then folks can innovate from there. The challenge we have, if you don't have a starting point basic implementation in place, and that becomes part of the fabric, it's hard to come to the market with a unified answer. Otherwise, you have piece part solutions come out there having to be plugged in for completeness by the rest of the industry, and we won't accelerate enough. So having done this single sign-on, a strong single sign-on, it now puts us in a position to go work with the different vendors to go and create a more complete solution. But at least the baseline authentication, strong authentication, ought to become a single sign-on, ought to become part of the fabric, is where we are thinking.
When do your Tri-Cipher options vest?
So let's wrap up here. Final comments and thoughts. Chris, let's start to
Yay, PCI.
Go man. PCI. That's all he had to say.
Is it time for a beer yet? I don't know. I'm out of energy.
Good.
We'll leave it to the Gartner guy. Go, Neil.
No, on the positive side, we went through this maturity with virtualization. And what's really nice about when we shift the discussion to cloud-based computing is, security's forefront in the conversation. Go back with virtualization. Again, VMware's been around a decade. People did not talk about virtualization and security. Really, it didn't take off until 2007, 2008, and recently. With cloud, though, security is first and foremost. And so to me, that's particularly exciting to see security involved at the very beginning of the discussion in the RFI.
Finally our day. We find our day.
It's our revenge, right? We're involved from the very beginning. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's great to see information security move up the stack to focus on protecting the information that we're in charge of, not devices. This notion of ownership, I think, is one that's outdated and doesn't scale, and cloud computing is just a piece of that evolution.
Good summary.
Yeah. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Brett.
I'm going to have to move you up.
Thank you all.